The next structure on your word list to identify is the ureter. We see the beginning of the ureter over here, this kidney model. So the renal pelvis, as it tapers, becomes the ureter. The ureter is a long muscular tube that is going to carry the urine that was produced in the kidney down to a holding reservoir, which is the urinary bladder. I'll show you the urinary bladder on both the male and female reproductive models, but we can't see the bladder or the next few structures on your word list on this model. Those structures being the trigone and the external urethral opening. I will show you those on the male and female reproductive models, as well as the urethra. We're going to move to the renal artery and renal vein. So we see the renal artery and renal vein over here. Renal artery we see in red, the renal vein is in blue. The renal artery is going to be carrying waste containing blood that needs to be cleansed by the kidney into the kidney. And as that renal artery carries blood into the kidney that needs to be cleansed, that renal artery is going to branch profusely, eventually forming and becoming part of the nephron, which is the blood filtering functional units of the kidney. The renal artery will be draining cleansed blood from the kidney. Let's turn our attention to the nephron. So again, when we look at the model of the kidney here, we see the cortex is the most superficial layer of tissue and the medulla is the deeper layer of tissue. If we take a look here at the cortex, you can see these light-colored circles. Those light-colored circles, as well as this tube system, is part of what is known as the nephron. If we were to magnify or to zoom in on this area of the model, this is what we would be seeing here. So again, this is the cortex, the superficial layer of tissue. This is the medulla, and you see these light-colored circular structures that are found in the cortex, as well as this tube system is part of the nephron. So I'm going to trace with the probe the nephron, so kind of where the nephron begins and where it ends. So the beginning of the nephron, of this nephron, would be here. It would extend through this tube all the way to this tube empties into this very long collecting tube. So that would be one nephron. If I was going to outline this nephron here, we would see it start here, and all of this tube system would be the nephron. The nephron stops here, and this very straight tube, which is connected to nephrons and is receiving fluid from them, is not part of the nephron. I'm going to identify those parts of the nephron as well as that very vertical tube now. So the nephron begins, we take this nephron here, it begins at this kind of collecting capsule here, and this is known as the Bowman's capsule. If we were to zoom in on this Bowman's capsule, this is what we would see. So this tube here, this collecting capsule, is known as the Bowman's capsule. Found within the Bowman's capsule is a cluster or a tuft of capillaries, and we see them very well here. We take a look at the model, we see them a little less magnified here. That tuft of capillaries is known as the glomerulus. So the glomerulus is surrounded by the Bowman's capsule. Those two structures, the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule, are what are known as the renal corpuscle. So the beginning of the nephron, each nephron starts at its renal corpuscle. The next structure to identify is going to be the proximal convoluted tubule. And that proximal convoluted tubule is the beginning of a tube system that is going to be receiving fluid from the Bowman's capsule. So fluid that is leaking out of the glomerulus collects in the Bowman's capsule, and then begins to pass through this convoluted or twisted short tube, which we see the beginning of here, and that is known as the proximal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule is the next structure on your word list. If we were to follow this proximal convoluted tubule and go down through this U-shaped loop, we'd end up finding ourselves in another convoluted tube, and this is the distal convoluted tubule. This is called the distal convoluted tubule because this part of the tube is distal to the renal corpuscle. So this is kind of the most distal part of the nephron, so it's referred to as the distal convoluted tubule. The loop of Henle, we have the descending loop of Henle, or the descending limb, as well as the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. This U-shaped tube here is known as the loop of Henle, or the nephron loop. Fluid that is collecting in the Bowman's capsule, making its way into the proximal convoluted tubule. That fluid eventually goes down from the cortex into the medulla through, this is the descending limb of the loop of Henle. Descending because the direction of the fluid movement is descending or moving deeper into the kidney tissue. After that U-shaped turn, the fluid moves up the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, and that fluid is then received by the distal convoluted tubule. So again, renal corpuscle, glomerulus and Bowman's capsule make up the renal corpuscle. The proximal convoluted tubule is the tube that is going to be draining fluid from the Bowman's capsule and into the descending limb of the loop of Henle. The ascending limb then receives that fluid and carries it to the distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule is connected to and drains its fluid into this vertical tube known as the collecting duct. The final few structures to identify a few of them are cellular and then the capsular space. So the capsular space would just be this space within the Bowman's capsule where that fluid is being collected. The macula densa, so the macula densa is a collection of cells that monitor sodium chloride concentrations in the tube system of the nephron. And these macula densa cells are found in the distal convoluted tubule. So here we see the distal convoluted tubule, and these cells are known as macula densa cells. Juxtaglomerular cells. These juxtaglomerular cells are specialized hormone-secreting cells that are found within the afferent arteriole. And the afferent arteriole is the vessel that carries blood that needs to be filtered and cleansed into the glomerulus. And in this model, these cells here represent the juxtaglomerular cells. Again, I've already mentioned the capsular space, and that capsular space is the space that is collecting the fluid from the glomerulus.